All right, is the mic working? You guys hear me okay? Great. Should probably get started because room looks pretty full. Welcome to Tips and Tricks for Building Rich Reports in SQL Server 2012 Reporting Services. Pretty much everything I'm going to show you today is also equally applicable to SQL Server 2008 R2 reporting services. A lot of it is also applicable going back to 2008. But in 2008 R2, we introduced a lot of new data visualizations, data bars, spark lines, indicators that are not there in 2008. So mostly 2008 R2 and 2012. It's really fantastic for me to be here in Europe. I love Europe. I do not want to go home. So if anybody would like to pay for all my living expenses here, let me know, and we'll talk afterwards. The objective today. You should come into this session knowing a little bit about reporting services and knowing how to build a basic report. But when you leave, I want you to have a good sense of some tips and tricks for designing reports that encourage immediate understanding and making insights pop. What that means is when a report consumer looks at your report, all the data may be there and that's all well and good, but they should not have to search for the real relevant data values and trends. They should actually pop out at them and just kind of jump off the screen. So the agenda is, first we're going to look at the tablix control. This is really, really fundamental to building reports so that you have a good, deep understanding of the tablix control. And so we're going to talk about how to build these grouped tabular structures that kind of organize your data. Once you've got that structure, we're going to look at, within that structure, how do you use colors and graphics and rich data visualizations, some of the ones that I mentioned that we introduced in the previous release, to really emphasize the data and make it just leap out at you. We're going to spend a lot of time on that part, by the way. This is going to be a very demo-heavy session. Number 3, we're going to talk just a little bit about some guidance, some suggestions for when one visual is better than another visual, depending on what you want to show in the type of data. And finally, I've got some miscellaneous tips and tricks that I want to squeeze in. There's a lot of content here. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to all the tips and tricks by the end of the session, but we'll get as many in as we can. I may not have time for any questions during the actual formal session time, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to hang out here, and if you have any questions, just come and see me afterwards. I'll also be at the BI booth, so you can come and ask me any questions about reporting services there. I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. I am Ricardo Moutier. I'm a program manager on the SQL Server reporting services team, and I focus on the engine of reporting services, so the file format, the data processing, the rendering to different export formats, all of that stuff. For today's demo, we're going to use sample data which is on vineyards and grape production across the United States. Okay, this is real data, comes from the United States Department of Agriculture. I am cheating a little bit though, because the actual data set doesn't have to do with grapes, it has to do with lettuce. Anybody who went to or saw the recording of the TechEd North America session saw that it was actually about lettuce, but you know, when I think of Europe and I think of agriculture, I think of these vineyards and beautiful places like Tuscany or Bordeaux or something, and I just can't bring to talk to you about lettuce farms in Idaho or something. So we're just going to pretend that it's grapes for my sanity. So starting with using the tablix control. What is a tablix? Well, I'll defer that question for a little bit and say that the most basic case of a tablix is that it's just a table. So here we have a basic table that should be about as simple as it gets and pretty familiar to everybody. You got some rows and you got some columns. There are 2 different kinds of rows in this tablix. So the header here is actually a row. We would refer to it as a static row because it's just static values. It doesn't repeat or anything like that. And then you've got a row group, or what we might refer to as a dynamic row member. So there's actually one of these in terms of its definition or its template that's got some expressions or field references in it, but then with the data, it repeats. Now, if you have a details table, the actual rows in your table as they appear on the screen may be pretty well one-to-one with the rows in your actual data set that come back from the query. However, in reporting services, you can also do aggregation, not just in the query, but also in the actual table. So you could have multiple rows for Arizona, for example, in the data set, but then the table is doing aggregation, and it's grouping the Arizonas together, and it's aggregating these numeric values. So with that, let's just jump into a demo. I'm going to show you how to build a basic table. Okay. So I could use the table wizard, which is very handy a lot of times, but I'm going to show you how to build it from scratch just so we get a really deep understanding. So I can just do insert table. It's going to insert a blank table here. And here I've got a data set. Let's zoom in on that for a sec. And you can see I've got all sorts of data on grape production, including states, years, and then the actual measurements. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag state to one column. I'm going to drag production to another column. And what you can see here is this 3- sort of icon here, if I zoom in on that. What that means is we've got a details group. A details group is a particular type of group that basically doesn't do any additional aggregation over what's in the query. So it's basically showing one row for each row that you've got in your data set. If I look down here in the row groups, in column groups at the bottom, you'll see that I've got a details group there. Okay? And it's got that same sort of icon. I'll give you another little trick. A lot of people work with reporting services for many years and never discovered this option. But there is this thing called advanced mode here. You often don't need it, but the day you do, you'll be glad you know that it exists. If I check advanced mode, what's going to happen is you're going to see not only just the dynamic row groups, which is usually what you work with, but also the static row groups. Okay? So if you look down here, you see you've got a static row group, or a static row, and then a row group. The static row is the table header. These 3 static columns are exactly that. They're the 3 static columns that I've got here. So, and when you look at influencing the pagination behavior of your reports, sometimes that will come in handy because you need to set something on a static row, like you want to say, repeat this across all the pages where the table appears or something. So, anyway, I'm going to turn that off. And we've got our row group here, so let's just run it, see what it looks like. And that's what a details table looks like. It looks like this is pretty much what's coming back from the query. The reason that we've got 10 rows coming back for each state is we've got data on 10 years. We're looking at the 1960s here. So there's one row for each year for each state. That's not actually what I want. I want one row aggregated for each state for all years. So maybe instead of adding the state column this way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that. And let's drag state not to the tablets, but let's drag it down to the row groups here. Okay? And it inserted the column for me. So let's just take a look at what it did here. If you notice, this icon here has changed. We now not only have the 3 lines for the details group, but we've also got this bracket-looking thing, which indicates that we've got a non-details row group. It's being grouped by something else. The other thing you'll notice is these dashed lines in between state and production. Whenever you see dashed lines in the tablets in design mode, that indicates a boundary between different regions of the tablets. So on the right-hand side, we've got the body of the tablets that we had before. And on the left-hand side, we've got the row group headers. So state is now a row group, and on the left of it is the header for that row group. Finally, these brackets that you see, and one of them is highlighted in orange, it shows you what scope you're in, what grouping scope. So on this cell that I have selected, we're in the details scope. If I were to go to this cell, we're also still in the details scope. But if I go out here, then state is highlighted because now we're in the state scope. We're not at the details level. So it just tells you for any cell in the tablets, what level am I grouped down to? So if I run this, we're a little closer, but we're still not there. Because what happened was I have one row group header for each state now, but I still have that details group. I forgot to get rid of it. So that's why we're still getting the individual rows. So what I can do is I can go down here and say delete this group. And whenever I delete a group, it prompts me, do you want to delete a group and also blow away all the rows and columns in the tablet structure related to that group? Well, I don't want to do that because what's going to happen is it's going to blow away this whole row. My tablet structure is actually fine. I just don't want it to group by the details anymore. I just want to group by state. So I'm going to delete the group and select delete group only. And now the tablet structure is left as is, but you'll see that the row group structure has changed. And now, in here, when I'm looking at these cells, what's highlighted in the scope is actually the state. So there's no further grouping after state. If I run that now, everything looks great, right? Wrong. There's still something wrong. The problem is When this was a details table, I was just showing the individual production values from the database. I haven't done any aggregation on these data values. So now when I'm looking at state, there are multiple values for production, and I haven't specified any aggregate function. So it doesn't know whether it should do a sum or an average or take the min or the max. So what it does by default is it just takes the first value, which is not what I want. So I can right-click here, though, on this placeholder, say summarize by, say sum. While I'm at it, I'm going to do one more thing, which is I'm going to convert this, or just going to change the formatting, change it to a number. I'm going to get rid of some decimal places and run that so that now I've got nice 1,000 separators. And you'll see that now I got larger numbers because it's properly doing the sum. Okay. What if I wanted an additional level of grouping? You don't have to have just one row group. You can have a hierarchy of row groups. So I could take year and just drag it in here. Oops. Year, drag it in here. There we go. And it's going to group on year. Alternatively, what I could have done was just drag year down to the row groups here under state. And you can see the hierarchy here now. So grouping by state and then grouping by year. And if I run this, now you get state, year, and production value. To add a total or subtotal, it's really easy. I can just right-click on the year. I'm in the year scope now, and I can say add a total before or after. I can do the exact same thing from down here in the row groups. So I'm going to add a total. By default, it'll put it below. So put the total row here. And there we go. Now we got a subtotal for each state for all years. So that's pretty much building a basic table. To come back to the question of what is a tablix, if any of you have worked with Reporting Services 2005, you'll remember that we have, when you have the option when you insert a data region of inserting a table, a matrix, or a list. And once you'd made your choice, there was no easy way to convert from a table to a matrix when you realized that you actually wanted a matrix. So in SQL Server 2008, what we did was we combined them all into one control called a tablix. It can be a table, a matrix, or a list. It's just a question of how you set up the grouping structure. Now, it might seem like they're still separate controls because in the actual report builder or report designer, you still choose insert table, insert matrix, insert list. But under the covers, they're all the same control, and you can easily convert from one to the other. So here you've got a table. Oh, sorry, here you've got a matrix, sometimes called a crosstab as well, where you can see we've got a row and a row group, just like we did in the table. But we've also got not just a static column, but we've got a column group or a dynamic column. So for each year, we're going to get a column. The beautiful thing about the tablix is you can actually combine sort of hybrid scenarios that are both, they have elements of being a table and they have elements of being a matrix. So here we've got the column group from the matrix, but beside it as a peer, we've got these 3 static columns. So that was something that was pretty impossible to do with Reporting Services 2005. So now let's go back and let's build a matrix. Going to get rid of this. And again, we'll create it from scratch. So we'll say insert matrix. And unlike a table, a matrix does not have a details group by default, because generally when you're doing a matrix, you're doing that sort of multi-dimensional crosstab sort of visualization, and you want aggregated values in the intersection cells. So here I'm going to drag state to rows, and I'm going to drag year to columns, and then in the body, I'm going to put production. And you notice that it automatically aggregates it, because it's in an aggregated scope. And here I'll just make this bold. I don't need this to be so wide, so I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. And again, let's format our numbers nicely, so I'll make this a number. Let's run it. Okay, so simple matrix, right? States on rows, years on columns. To prove to you that it's really easy to convert from one to the other, let's go back. Just going to undo, and I will get back to the table that I created, right? Let's see. It's what we were showing earlier. It's not a matrix. To make it a matrix, all I'm going to do is I'm going to say I no longer want year on row groups. I'm going to add a column group for years. So we can delete years here. I'm just going to get rid of this whole column. In this case, yes, you can blow away the column. I don't want it either. I don't need this column either. Get rid of that. I'm going to take year. I'm going to drag it to column groups now. So now we've got a column group. The headers are in kind of weird positions, so I'm going to take this and just copy and paste it up here. And then I don't need this additional row, so I'll get rid of that. And I don't need the total as well either. I'm going to get rid of that. So, by the way, going back to those dashed lines, if I zoom in here again, you'll see that now we've got 4 sets of dashed lines. When you have a matrix and you've got row groups and column groups, you've got all 4 regions of the tablix. You've got the row group headers, the column group headers, they intersect to create the body, and then the last piece is the tablix corner. Okay. When I run this, there we go. We got the exact same matrix. So just by adding column groups, you've effectively transformed a table to a matrix. I'm going to make this bold. Now, let's add some additional static columns to this matrix. I want to pull in the number of acres that were planted. But if I pull this in, what's going to happen is it's going to think that I want a group, right? That's what happened before when we added this to the tablix. It grouped again by year. That's not what I want. I don't want you to group by that number. I just want another static column. So one way I can do that is I can just right-click here and say Insert Column and say outside the group to the left. Okay, so Insert Column, outside group to the left. And then this little control here allows me to just pick any field from my data set. So I'm going to pick the number of acres planted. Let's format that. And I can run that. And there you go. We see that static column there beside the dynamic columns. Let's pull in another one. Let's pull in the number of acres harvested. And I can just put that beside here and done. But let's make it more interesting. Let's say that I don't want the number of acres, absolute acres harvested. I want to know what percentage of the acres planted were harvested. So I'll make that a %. And here I can go beyond a basic field reference and create an expression. So I'll just right-click and say expression, and I'll get my expression editor. Right? So right now it's just referring to field reference. I'm going to say the sum of the total harvested divided by the total planted. Okay, which is a pretty simple expression. And I'm going to format that, since it is a percentage, I'm going to format it as a %. Let's add 1 decimal place and run it. And there you go. You've got our % harvested. And you can see that there's some variation among the states. Some have almost 100% or 100%, and some are much lower. Let's pull in another one. Let's pull in the production. But here I'm going to do something more interesting as well. I don't want the actual production value. I want to do % of total. This is something that a lot of people like to do. Basically is the contribution of each of these states to the total production across the United States. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this expression. Now, how would I get % of total? I want to know the production for Arizona divided by the production for the United States. Well, so I'll do sum of production divided by sum of production. It's the same field. So what's different about it? What's different is the scope, right? One is production for the scope that we're in, which is the default scope, which is down to the state level. And the other one I need to break out to a higher scope level, which is the entire tablix. So scopes can have names. To find out the name of this tablix, I'll just right-click in the corner of this tablix here, say tablix properties. If I zoom in, it's tablix 1. They didn't really give it a good name. That's the default name, but that's fine. So let me go back to my expression. And now we'll say, in this second aggregate, I'm going to override the default scope and say tablix 1. Okay? So the first one is default scope. Second one is an overridden scope. And that's also a percentage, so I'll make it a percentage. 1 decimal place. Run it. Now you get % of total. And there you can see that California produces 61% of the grapes in the United States. Arizona another 23%, and then everything else is pretty negligible. So I think that is pretty much it for creating a basic matrix, and we've also got some static columns there. Let's go back to the slides. That covers the first point. So we created a matrix like this. Okay? It's got all the data there. It's got lots of interesting data that could help us, learn something about grape production, maybe make better decisions if we were running a vineyard or something like that. But I really have to look at this and search for insights. They don't just jump out at me. I'm not alerted, or my eyes are not drawn to any interesting data values or interesting trends. And it doesn't look that great either. It looks kind of dated. So how can we make it look better? First of all, let's take out any fluff, right? That tablix that I was showing you looks sort of like a typical tablix that we might create in like Crystal reports 20 years ago or something like that. So if you've been following the whole Metro design philosophy that Microsoft is embracing, it's really about focusing on content and having minimal fluff. So for example, if we don't need lines, let's not have all sorts of borders and stuff like that. So I'm using a thin font here, no bold or really obnoxious fonts or anything like that. I'm using space to delineate the different columns and different rows. If I use space effectively, I really don't need the borders. I'm dimming the labels. By that I mean the column headers. The reason is, again, with the Metro design philosophy is I want to focus on the data. Okay, state, average planted, harvested, these titles or these captions, they're not actual data, they're just metadata. So they're less important. So I want to diminish those and have the actual data values be more prominent. And finally, one accent color. There's a little blue strip there. If you are going to use color just to pretty up your reports in various places, my suggestion would be use it sparingly. The reason is not because color is bad or anything like that. Color is great. In fact, it's very powerful. But for that reason, you will often want to use color to denote meaning. You want to use color to show whether things are good or bad or within a certain threshold or not. One other point about that is often the typical BI colors will be the traffic light colors, red, yellow, green. So good accent colors might be, you don't have to stay away from those, but for example, blue is different from those, so is pretty good as an accent color. One way that I can make the insight really pop out at me and I can draw my eye to the right thing is, rather than just having text, let's use some richer data visualizations. So here, for example, let's say we have a rule that we say that what we really want is for states to harvest 95% or more of their acreage. Between 90 and 95% is all right. Under 90%, we've got a problem. A great way to show that would be with an indicator. So here we have an indicator. The guidance here is if you add an indicator, you will see all sorts of fantastic icons. The simpler ones in practice tend to look better and work better. So here we're just using a simple circle. The only exception to this would be the accessibility issue. There's a good portion of the population that is partially or completely colorblind, and this would not work very well for them. That's when you might want to incorporate shapes. But if you don't have such a requirement, or that issue aside, simpler shapes tend to work better than these more elaborate icons, which can be just distracting. So the previous case that I showed you was actually a rule where it was discrete. It's either green or it's yellow or it's red. Another thing that you might want to do is you might want to show a color scale. You can do this in Excel. There isn't a great built-in feature for this in reporting services. That's something that we'd like to address in future, but it is possible through custom code and expressions to do this. So here we're using a color scale where it's a continuous range from green to red, and you can see these shades in between. Again, you probably want to keep this simple, keep it to a small area. You can see here that it doesn't take a lot of area to have this color be visible and to draw your eye to the right things. Some people prefer to do things like this. This is actually more common to just make the whole cell background this color. It's not bad. I prefer the previous approach, except in one case. There's one case where you actually want to do this, and that is a heat map. When you have a large area, you don't want to have a bunch of these squares. This heat map sort of visualization is actually quite nice. Finally, the other thing that you can do is you can actually just color the text itself. This tends to be a little bit less readable than some of the previous approaches, but if you do it right, it's not bad as well. So the guideline here is when you're filling something, you're filling a square or you're filling the background of a cell, you can use lighter fills, and fills should be lighter colors. But when you're coloring lines or text, they should be darker colors. Here's a couple of examples. They may not show up exactly as I want on the projector, but that are not very readable, especially this dark red background. Not enough contrast there. So just be wary of that when you're coloring text. Finally, just going back to the previous slide, a lot of the numbers, a lot of the stuff that's just cluttering up this table is these dynamic columns with the years. It's just hard to get a sense of the trend. For Arizona, are they producing more grapes? For California, are they producing less? Or what's changing, right? What's the trend? So whenever you have something over time like that, rather than just show all the raw data, you might want to use something like Sparkline. And you can always show the details optionally. You can allow users to expand or collapse them, right? And then if you want to show magnitude on top of just trend, you can maybe just show its subtotal, show the average, or show the grand total. So remember, when you have time and you want to show something over time, especially if you're interested in the trend more than the absolute values, consider using a Sparkline. Again, we're using simple colors here. I could have used some vibrant color for the Sparkline, but I really don't need to, so I'm just using a gray. Might want to have the details still be available and still be expandable. Aligning axes is a really interesting decision that you have to make whenever you use data bars or sparklines in a table. So here there is a horizontal axis, which is time. You definitely do want that to be lined up from one cell to the other. And that does that by default. The question with the sparkline is about the vertical axis. Do you want the overall magnitude to be synced and the same, like basically to have the same range across all rows in the table? Well, because this is so heavily biased towards Arizona and California, if I did that, all the other ones would be basically flat lines. So that's not really my priority. My priority is I want to see the trend for each of these states. So I haven't synced the vertical axis, which again is also the default. Finally, here we have an example of a data bar, right? We've added this column for yield, and I want to show how large or how small it is. A great way to just draw your eye to the min and the max there is to use a data bar. You can use color as well. It's great to mix in color with the data bar as well. So here you can see that California, which has really healthy yield, has this rich green color, and Florida, which doesn't have so healthy of a yield, has this kind of not so healthy yellow color. Right? It's kind of redundant with the length of the data bar, you could argue, but some people like it, so use that trick if you like it. Again, you have a question about aligning axis. With a data bar, you pretty well only have one axis, which is the length of the data bar, and you definitely do want to align that. Otherwise, the data bars will just be all the same length. And those are aligned for you by default. Here, going back to the percentage of total column, a way to really draw your eye to that and draw your eye to the major contributors is to use a pie chart. People have very different, strong opinions about a pie chart, but one of the cases where it works better is just showing the contribution of something towards a whole, or showing progress towards a goal or something like that. So here I've created a sparkline sparkline doesn't have to be a line. Could be a column chart, could be a pie chart. Some people call these spark pies. And again, use simple colors. And I really prefer that they start at 12 o'clock. They don't do this in the product by default, unfortunately, and it's one of the most buried things I'm going to show you how to do today. But if you learn that trick, it's really nice for them to start at 12 o'clock. Finally, let's say that we're not as interested as comparing the states to one another as we are just looking at each state and looking at some of the key values and trends within each state. Instead of using a tablix, we might want to use something totally different altogether. Might want to use this sort of card layout or this sort of list-based layout. If you've seen any of the demos about PowerView, there's actually a visualization built into PowerView called a card that looks pretty much like this. You can do the exact same thing in more traditional reporting services reports manually. Again, still with a tablix control. You can use a picture. Here I've used a map. You could also imagine using a state flag or something like that. Butterfly alignment. So here you can see these headings and the actual values. The headings are aligned right. The values are aligned left. Just makes it really easy to read. And keep some space between the cards so that, again, it's just easier delineate one card from the other and easier to read. And again, one accent color. Here you could also consider using conditional formatting, and maybe if there's some KPI or something for each state overall, we could have that color actually be meaningful, have it range from green to red or something. But otherwise, just stick with one accent color. So let's do a quick demo of that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show color. So for the percent harvested here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a column to the right of this. And in here, I'm going to put an indicator. Remember that rule of 90 to 95 to 100%? I just right-click on this table cell, and I say Insert. And within a table cell, I have all sorts of options for adding a nested visualization. If you zoom in here, you can see all these different options. What I want to add is I want to add an indicator. And again, lots of different options. I just choose something basic. I'll choose this red, yellow, green circles. And then I'm going to click on this. Actually, I need this expression. This is our expression for the percent harvested. I'm going to copy that because the indicator is going to be bound to the exact same thing. So here, I'll take this indicator, I'll now bind it to an expression, and I'm going to copy in the same expression. I don't want a border on this, so I'm going to get rid of the border. And let's just run that, see what it looks like. There we go. So we got a nice indicator, green, yellow, red, depending on the percent harvested. Another example I showed was using the color scale. So instead of just discrete colors, I can use a color scale. What I'm going to do is insert a rectangle into this table cell. And then out here, I'm going to put another rectangle. And let me just zoom in here. Okay, I'm going to make this rectangle kind of small. Sometimes the grid lines are not your friend. Okay. And then I'm going to move this. I'm going to just drag and drop it. Drag and drop it inside here. And then I can use Control and arrow keys to really fine-grain move this around. And now I've got to color this thing. So I mentioned that there's no built-in feature to do the color scale for you. One of my colleagues, Bob Myers, has some sample code on his blog, which is going to be in the slide deck that you guys will all get. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste that code into my report. The way you get to the code in Report Builder is you just right-click here, anywhere in the background, and say Report Properties. And then there is a tab called Code, and you can just paste your VB.NET code in there. At the top, he's got a good comment here, which is the assembly reference that I need, because I need a reference to system.drawing, because it's doing all this color creation. So in here, I can add or remove an assembly reference. I'm just going to add the fully qualified assembly reference to system.drawing in the .NET framework. And now what I can do is I can right-click on this rectangle and say Rectangle Properties. And most report items have a fill. The fill color can be a static color, or it could also be an expression. So I'm going to choose the expression. I have the expression saved here. And you'll see that all it is code dot, and then it's calling a custom VB.NET function that's in that code behind. And it's just passing in the harvested percent, and then it's saying use the range between 8 and 1. So click OK. And then I will run this, and we'll see what it looks like. There you go. So now you can see our color scale squares. I'm going to delete this and show the last thing. Last thing was I can just actually set the color of the text itself. And to do that, I just say text box properties. Again, go to the font color. Whenever you see that FX, that is the chance for you to put in an expression, and I have an expression for this as well. Here what I'm doing is calling, there was a standard function that we called before, RYG, red, yellow, green, which uses the same colors that Office and Excel uses. Here I'm passing in custom values, the color names red, orange, and green, so that I get darker colors because I want darker colors for the text. And then if I run this, there you go. You can see the colored text. So that's enough about color. Let's look at creating a sparkline. So this year thing is still here. We still have this big matrix full of all these years. What if I wanted to create a sparkline for this? I'm going to insert a column outside of the group to the left. By outside of the group, I mean I don't want this to be grouped by year. This is going to be for all years. And I'm going to call this trend. And here I'm going to say insert sparkline. I like the area sparklines, especially when we're showing something over time, a line would work or an area would work as well. But the area, instead of just having this small line, you have the colored fill below it. So I prefer to use the area. I'm going to get rid of the border on this thing. And the category group here, the x-axis, is going to be the year. So I'll select the year. And then the value is going to be the production. Finally, I want to take this series and I want to set the properties. So I'll just click this properties button. Because what I want to do is I want to change the colors. I want to just make it gray. So the fill is going to be a light gray. And the border is going to be a dark gray. It looks like what I want. Let's run it. There we go. There's a sparkline. So now that we have the sparkline, I don't want to show these years by default anymore. So what I want to do is I want to have a toggle. To do that, I'm going to say insert a row outside of the group above. And I'm going to call this show details. And then I'm going to give this text box a good name. So if you go to text box properties, it's called text box 47. It's not a great name. Let's call it show details text box. And you'll see why I'm going to do that in a minute. So when I go over to year, this year group is what I want to toggle the visibility of. So I'm going to right click on the group and say group properties. And then go over to visibility. By default, instead of showing it, okay, I want to hide it. So I'll hide it. And then I'll also say display can be toggled by this other report item. This other report item is going to toggle the visibility. And now I have to pick the report item name. That's why I gave it a good name. So I'm going to call it, I'm going to choose as show details text box. Whenever I have expand and collapse something, when it collapses, you probably want to collapse to something meaningful. So what I'll do here is I'll add a total. So when it collapses, we'll see at least the subtotal. So let's just say add total. And it doesn't know whether I want a total for the rows or for the columns. I want a subtotal for the columns. So I'll choose columns. And by default, it's going to give me a sum. What I actually want is I want the average production. So let me call this average production. I guess I need to make that a little bit wider so that it fits. And as always, I can click on here and say summarize by average instead of sum. And now when I run this, actually let me merge this across so I could just take the whole width. Now when I run this, year should be collapsed by default, which it is. How did I get borders back? I don't know how that happened. But if I click this, then it expands. I may have forgotten to do that actually. So let me select all these cells and say get rid of the borders. There we go. So now I can expand and collapse this. Even when it's collapsed, I see the trend and I see the average production. So I don't bombard people with data unless they really want it. Now to add the Spark pie. So the percent of total, I want to show that as a pie chart. we're going to add another sparkline here. So insert column to the right. I'll make this small. It doesn't need to be very big. And then I'm going to say insert sparkline. And here I can choose a shape, pie chart. So like I said, sparkline doesn't have to be a line. I'm going to get rid of the border. It likes to put borders on everything. And then what is my pie chart going to be bound to? Well, one thing is it's really just the percentage of the total. That's going to be one slice of the pie. So I'm going to copy that expression. So we'll add an expression here. I'll paste that expression in. So that's our percent of total expression. What is the other slice of the pie? Normally you would do that with category groups, right? You have maybe one slice for each year or country or something. Here I don't really have a category group. It's just the percent of total, and then the rest of it has to add up to 100%. So I'm not going to have any category group. I'm going to get rid of it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another series here. This time I'm just going to do whatever makes it add up to 100%, which is 1 minus the other expression. So click OK. Finally, I want to make this look good. I wanted it to be gray, so I will just set the properties on each of these series. For both of them, the border is going to be dark gray, and for this one, the fill is going to be a light gray. For this other one, I'm going to make the border the same color, dark gray, but the fill is going to be white. Done. Let's run it. There you go. The only problem, like I said, is that it likes to start the pie at 3 o'clock instead of 12 o'clock. Don't know why it does that, but I don't like it, so let's fix it. This is going to be one of the most, like I said, buried options that I'll show in this demo. It's one of the only ones where I need to show the property pane. I haven't been using this property pane a lot, but now I need it. And I just click on here. And for the chart, there is a property here called custom attributes. If I expand that, and there's one of them here called pie start angle, which is 0. It considers 0 to be 3 o'clock by default. So I'm going to change it to 270. And there we go. Now, let's get rid of the property pane. Don't need it anymore. Now it starts at 12 o'clock, which looks better to me. Okay, another thing that I wanted to show was data bars. Data bars are really nice. Let's add something here for, add a column to the right. What I want here is the yield. Okay, this is the number of, I think, hundreds of pounds or something, hundreds of tons per acre. But I don't want just a text box here. Convert this to a number. I don't want just a text box. I want a data bar. So what I'm going to do, I want a data bar actually below the text. So I'm going to insert a row below. So I'll say inside group below. And then I will say insert a data bar. Yep, the default one is fine. And then I'm going to check this. No borders, as always. And the value here is going to be the yield. And then I don't want this to be so big. It doesn't need to be so big. I just want a little sliver, so I'll make this tiny. Okay, and then I'll run it. Well, it looks okay, except for one thing, which is it's not so tiny. This is a feature in reporting services. The technical name for this feature is that it's a bug. It's worse than that. It's a bug in one of the components that I own. So unfortunately, it's not fixed. I don't make a point of demoing bugs, but I really like this trick, and you're going to hit this bug if you try it. So while we're fixing it, I want to give you a way of getting around it. By the way, it looks like it copied the coloring on this, which I don't need, so let's just make this black. To get around this, the way you put multiple things inside a TableX cell is you use a rectangle as a kind of just the main container in the TableX cell, and then you put those child things inside that rectangle. So here, what I'm going to do is move out this text box. And instead, what I'm going to put in this cell is I'm going to say insert rectangle. We'll make this row a little bit taller while we move some stuff into it. First, I'm going to move this text box inside that rectangle. And then I'm going to move the data bar. Let's make it a little bit bigger while we're moving it. Move the data bar inside the rectangle as well. Okay, just below it. And now I can make that smaller. Sorry. Make that a little bit smaller. Now we'll move that inside. I can make this row smaller now. And I no longer need this row at all, so I'm going to delete it. And now, there we go, much better. Now you'll notice that the data bar is left aligned because, in left to right languages we would usually have the bar going from left to right, and we usually align numbers to the right so that the decimal points and the thousand separators and everything line up. However, the reason that they line up is so that we can compare the magnitudes. The data bar already helps us do that, so we don't really need this to be right aligned. So I would left align this. And if I run that now, I think that looks a little bit better. Last thing I want to do is I just want to pretty up this report a little bit. So I'm going to move this down a bit. I want to give it more of a Metro look and feel. So I'm just going to grab this, and I'm going to change the font to Sego UI Lite, which is the font that's used in Windows 8 and all the Metro UI for large headings. I'll make it size 36. I will make it, let's give it maybe this indigo color because we're dealing with grapes. Here I'm going to set all the fonts to Sego UI, not Sego UI Lite. It's a good font for smaller fonts in the actual core content in your report. I don't need this to be bold anymore. I don't want this to be bold either. And I just want one border, which is under here. I want it to be 1 1/4 point maybe. And I want it to be that same accent color, that indigo. And I want it only on the bottom. And if I run that, that looks a lot nicer. Okay, so those were a bunch of tips on emphasizing data and really turning a plain old table into a really nice looking table. Next thing I wanted to move on to is choosing the right visual. So we just talked about this, so just to reemphasize this point, plain old table, really nothing jumps out at me. I have to search for whatever I'm supposed to be learning from this table, and any interesting values or trends, I have to go find them. If you give me something like this, things will immediately jump out at me. California harvests the vast majority of what it plants. Florida is not doing so well. Yield, much better in California, much worse in Florida. Arizona and California, the dominant grape producers, right? And then the actual trend. California is producing more, Colorado is producing less. Connecticut seems to be getting out of the grape business altogether. So, make your tables pop, is the point. Okay, the right visual. Let's ignore tablexes for a second. Let's just imagine, let's turn our attention maybe to some basic charts that you might also have in your report. When should you use which type of chart? There's a whole bunch of literature that's written on this stuff. Just a few of the most fundamental tips and tricks. Here you have 3 categories, 3 different types of grapes, 3 different varieties, and we want to show the production for each of those. Should we use a bar chart or a column chart, or should we use a line chart? Well, there's no sequence here. These are just categories. There's no reason to draw some sort of line that suggests a sequence between Cabernet and Merlot, right? So really, we should not use a line chart. We should use a column chart. Here, there is a sequence. We're showing production by year. So when you do this by columns, it gets very busy. If we wanted to bucket these into like decades or something and make a histogram, then we might use columns. But if we're showing a lot of values and we're trying to show a trend, we really should use the line chart or an area chart. Here we got a really busy line chart. And you see a lot of these. You have to ask yourself, what is the point of this line chart? Right? If the point was to show differences in magnitudes between production between different states, it's probably not the best visualization. And if the point was to show the trend for each of the states, it's also really busy. Right? We've got too many lines. The colors start becoming too similar. They're too jumbled up together. If the point was to show the trend for each of these states, then maybe a table or a list or something with a spark line would have been a better choice. You can see it's much easier to read on the right here. So when you're showing something like that, just trends or patterns for different groups, consider using a bunch of Spark lines instead of a big chart. Finally, let's consider you want to check for correlation between two different factors or two different variables. Maybe you want to see whether yield and percent harvested are at all related or how much of a correlation there is. I could use a scatter chart. I could use a clustered column chart. Neither one is arguably terrible. I can see that when columns are the same height or similar height, there's a good correlation. When they're different height, there's a big spread. But really, the scatter chart excels at this, right? You can quickly see that there is a pretty good correlation, and your eyes are immediately drawn to an outlier like Hawaii that's sitting up over here. So when you want to show correlation, consider using a scatter chart. Finally, more tips and tricks. We're actually doing pretty well on time, so hopefully I'll be able to show you all of these. One tip and trick is I just have some data that is not in a database, it's not in a cube or anything. It's just some data that I got off the web or got off somewhere, and I have it on my clipboard. I want to just copy and paste it into my report. How do I do that? Another is integrating related data. So I want to have a table that joins fields from two different data sets from two different data sources. Whoops, sorry. The other is displaying short lists, and that's best shown by example. And finally, some tips and tricks for outputting to Excel. So first of all, you have some data. Let's imagine that, for example, we want to check for a correlation between sunshine, how much sunshine the state gets, and how good its grade production is. We can go out to the web and get some data on sunshine percentage. How do we get it into a report? Do we really have to stuff it into a database somewhere? Hopefully not. Well, we first have to consider what sort of data source. Reporting services, you have different types of data sources that connect to SQL, that can run a SQL query, or that can run an MDX query, or that can pull data from a SharePoint list, and so on and so forth. Which one should we use if we just want to embed the data right in that query? Right? One of the easiest ones to use in this sort of scenario is the XML data source, because you can actually just paste an XML document right in the query, and we can use that. So if we can get the clipboard data as a bunch of XML elements, this is the way we can do it. We want to make this a lot easier going forward, so this stuff gets into some pretty advanced tricks. If you saw what we've been doing with Power View and with Power Pivot, it's great because you can just put the data into an Excel sheet, and then you can make that a Power Pivot workbook, and now you can query that as an analysis services data source. But this is another way of doing it. So here, you're going to have a bunch of Excel formulas. We'll use Excel to actually help us build up the XML elements, and then we'll just paste the XML elements in the report. So this is what you get. This is the sort of thing that you want to create, right? And then we're going to put that right in the report, right in the query. So let's show you how to do that. Here I have some data that we got on sunshine metrics for states across the United States. This is what it looked like on the web page. It was just an HTML page. When I paste it in here, that's what it looks like when I paste it in Excel just from the web. I use this cool feature in Excel called text to columns, which will actually do flat file parsing and CSV parsing and that sort of stuff. And then you get something like this. So we got it structured now. And then I converted it to an Excel table. So with the two columns that I need, which is basically state and the sunshine percentage. What I want to do is I want to use Excel formulas to build up some XML attribute pairs, name value pairs, and then I'll build up some element from those. I only need two attributes. One is state code and the other is sunshine percentage. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Excel formulas and table references in Excel. They're all just Excel features. So I'm going to say table, I think it's table 5. And the table, whoops, sorry. First, I want to get the name of the attribute is going to be state, but we'll put a nice reference to the name of whatever the header is in this report or in this table. And then the header that I want is state. Oh, sorry, I need a concat here, concatenating this. And then I need an equal sign, a quote, and then I need the actual value. So again, table 5. And then I want the state. And then I need an end quote. Did that work? Yes, it did. Except for here. I think I just overwrote that by default. Okay, so there you go. State equals the state code. If you want to see what that expression ended up looking like, there you go. It's just a concat with references to the table and a bunch of equal signs and quotes. Not the prettiest thing, but it does work. So this is already built out with the rest of it. I got the state attribute, the sunshine percentage attribute, and then we just built an element out of those. It doesn't matter what I call the element, as long as I refer to it correctly in the report. So here's just called X. So what I do then is I take all this, just take the Excel cells, copy them, and I go to my report. I'm going to open a new report here. Just give this a minute. And clipboard data. Okay, so here I've got two data sources. One is the main one. The other one is this embedded XML. The data source type here, you can see, is XML. The connection string is empty. I would have used a connection string if I were connecting to an XML file on the web, or if I were calling a web service or something, but that's not what I'm doing. It's completely embedded in the query, so there's no connection string necessary. In the data set, I've got this Sunshine data set, which uses that XML data source. And you can see that there's some boilerplate XML query language that we have. And this root thing here, that's where I'm going to stick the embedded data. So I just copy and paste it in there. And it's going to paste as all the XML elements. Now, up here, I need to list the attributes, elements or attributes that I want to pull into the data set. One of them is called state. The other is called sunshine percentage. And by default, it's going to pull in everything as a string, but the sunshine percentage is actually a numeric value, so I will tell it that it should be a decimal. You can zoom in so you can see that. Okay. Just to test this, by the way, I can go to the query designer, and I can actually just run this and see what the data set looks like. So that's what it got out of the XML. Once I've done that, I can just drag state in here, sunshine percentage in there, run it, and there you go. State and sunshine percentage from data embedded completely in the report. Okay, let's go back to slides. Next tip, related data. This is a cool one. A lot of people have asked for this. If you're lucky, all your data is in one data source, right? It's all in one SQL Server database, or it's all in one cube or something like that. But if you've got something a little bit more tricky, you have some data that's somewhere else. It's in another different type of data source. And link servers or whatever is not going to help you do that. Maybe it's in a file, maybe it's on the clipboard, maybe it's in the cloud, maybe it's an OData service. Not something that you can easily join in the query. How can you do it in the report? Well, you're somewhat limited in how much, there aren't really robust capabilities to join data sets together. But there is a basic lookup functionality that we added in SQL Server 2008 R2 that is useful in a lot of basic scenarios. Here's an example of a basic scenario. You have states, and then you have the yield for each states that comes from the main data set. You want to just pull in one additional field from another data set, which is that sunshine percentage that we showed. The thing that links them together, the join key, is the state. So how do we do that? That's where you use the lookup function. The way the lookup function works is you use it from a data region that's bound to the main data set, and you say, what's the field in this data set that we're going to match on? What's the field in the other data set that we're going to match on? What's the field that we should get back from the other data set? And finally, what is the name of the other data set that we should be looking at? So 4 parameters you need. Show you how to do that. Let's open up related data. So here we've got a scatter chart. I want to check for correlation between the percentage or the amount of sunshine that a state gets and the yield of grapes. They're probably correlated. More sunshine, better yield, right? So here, if I run this, the Y value, the yield, is being plotted correctly because it comes from the main data set, but the sunshine percentage is not bound to anything because I don't have that data yet. I mean, I do have the data set here, but I don't know how to do this join. So here you can see the X value is not bound to anything. So I need to bind it to an expression. And that's where I'm going to use the lookup function. So I'm going to say lookup, And then, okay, so field in this data set, in the production data set, the state code field is called code. So fields code.value. In the other data set, it's called state, so they don't have to be named the same thing. Call it state.value. What is the actual value that I want back? It's called sunshine percentage. Finally, what is the other data set called? Well, it's just called sunshine. Okay, so those are the 4 values. The 2 that I'm matching on in 2 different data sets. What do I want back, and where am I supposed to be doing this lookup? Click OK. I'll run it. And there we go. Now we've got a working scatter chart. And we just joined that from 2 different data sets. Another cool trick is short lists. So what I mean by short lists is, let's say you just have a one-to-many relationship with a fairly low cardinality. The many end of that just has a few values. You don't need to break that out to all the different rows because you're not going to show details for those rows. You just want to show that short list of values. So for example, if we group the United States into regions, each region maybe only has a few states. Just want to show a comma-separated list of that in one column. The way you do that is using a join function. What a join function does, this is just a VB.NET function, is it takes an array or a collection of values, and then it will join them into one string using whatever delimiter that you specify. To actually get those values, we use a function called lookupSet. So lookupSet is analogous to lookup. What lookup does is it looks up values in another data set and gets back a single value. What lookupSet does is it looks up a value in another data set and gets back multiple rows that match that value. So you're chaining these. LookupSet will get us back a bunch of rows. Join will join them together into one string. We have some sample code, again, that'll be linked from the slides on the blogs of how to show you if you need to do sorting, if your data set is not already sorted, or if you need to do distinct sort. But in this case, we're just going to do the basic join. So let's open this up. Short lists. Okay, so see what this looks like now? I've got Midwest, and then I've got the individual states. And you can see that I've got in my data set a region and a state code. Right? So I want to join the state codes together. To do that, first of all, you can see that I've got a region group and I've got a details group. I don't want that details group anymore. So let's get rid of it, delete it. Now leave the table structure as is, just get rid of the group. And here I need to change this expression. I don't want the state code. What I want to do is I want to do a lookupSet. So lookupSet. By the way, if you expand this expression editor, it's got all the functions. It's got them all categorized. So if I were to look at text, you'll see a bunch of text functions. And for example, if I go to miscellaneous, you'll see lookup and you'll see lookupSet. And here, if I zoom in, it will give you an example of the parameters that it expects and all that. So if you ever forget, that's where you can find that information. So lookupSet, I want to look up, I'm going to match on the region, so it's called region. And I'm actually going to join to myself. I'm going to look up the states in the same data set, so it's also called region. The thing I want to get back, sorry, it's region.value. Region.value. Field that I want to get back is called state code.value. And then the data set that I'm looking in is just myself. It's called state regions. So now I've got the array. The last thing I need to do is do the join. So I'm going to do join. I'll wrap this in a join. And then what I want, the delimiter that I want in between these values is just a comma and a space. So that's what that looks like. Doing the lookupSet, getting back the state codes, and then joining them with commas in between them. And now if I run this, hopefully I typed that in correctly. Yeah, I did. Let's just make this bigger. There you go. So we've got a comma-separated list that we created from multiple rows in the data set. Finally, output to Excel. Output to Excel could mean one of two things. It could mean a data dump. And what I really mean there is you're exporting to CSV, and then you're opening the CSV in Excel or importing the CSV in Excel. Typically there, you want to just get a flat denormalized list of this data, which isn't necessarily what you get by default, because reporting services doesn't know what you want to output and what you don't, how much data you need and how much data you don't. So I'm going to show you how to tweak that. And the other would be rich Excel export. The actual Excel renderer in reporting services is actually a layout renderer. So all the fonts and stuff like that and all the layout goes into the Excel worksheet. So you have two different kinds of export to Excel. If you just took this table that we created and took what reporting services created by default and exported it to Excel, you're going to get this. There's all sorts of grouping and the different groups in the table, all the sparkline data, all the indicator data is in here. You can see that it's sparse. There's a bunch of weird stuff because of the hierarchical grouping. It's probably stuff that you don't even want in the export here. Right, you can see all this stuff. So that's not what you want. Some tips for improving that, or controlling that at least, is the names that you set on report items influences the names that goes in Excel. So if you're exporting and you're seeing a bunch of text box 14 and text box 127, give your text box better names and you'll get better results in Excel. Same thing goes for the names of groups. Those are also will surface in Excel sometimes. You can control whether something to any data renderer, this includes not only CSV but also XML and Atom, whether something is output to that or not by setting this data element output option. Auto will try and figure out, is this visible, is it hidden, what sort of report item is it, and make the decision for you. But you can explicitly take control and say, output this to the data renderer or don't. Finally, you can also, for layout renderers, like the Excel layout renderer, you can hide things. And in SQL Server 2008, R2 and later, you can conditionally hide things depending on what format you're rendering to. And whenever you hide something, if you still want it to show up in data renderers like CSV, you can explicitly set data element output to output, even though visually it's hidden when the report renders. And then you can get something a lot nicer like this. So to show you how to do that, let's open up output to Excel. Here you can see, for example, this state column here. If I look at what this looks like, its name is state 1, so I could give it a better name. If I were to look at something else here, this is text box 162. That's not very good, so we'll call it percent of total. This indicator here, I don't even really want to render this to the CSV. It's going to be the same value as the percent of total. Actually, sorry, this is the pie. I don't want that rendered there. It's going to give me additional grouping for each of the pie slices, and I don't want that. So what I can do is I can just open the properties pane here and say data element output is not auto, but it's no output. Okay. I could do the same for the sparkline, and here I can actually just hide a column entirely. I can just set its visibility to hidden if it was purely for the Excel output, and then I could set data element output to output. At the end of this, what I get is a much nicer export, okay? Because I've hidden a bunch of stuff, and I've set a bunch of stuff to data element output is no output. So we'll get something nicer. For rich Excel export, I'm not going to show this, but just to give you a heads up, some things that you might want to consider when you're using the rich Excel export. Whenever you have a page break in your report, you can actually control the page name, and when you render to Excel, that becomes the worksheet name. This was a really requested feature as well that we added in 2008 R2. To set renderer-specific visibility, you can actually use a new property that we introduced in 2008 R2 called render format. So you can go to the expression. I'll show this really quickly, actually. Just look at this text box, for example, and say visibility. And the visibility, you can say show or hide it based on an expression. And then in here, there's a built-in field called renderformat.name, which is the name of the export format. It's the programmatic name. So it's not the translated name or anything like that. And then you can say equals Excel. So if it, If it equals Excel, then hidden is true. I'll give you one additional tip, which is that in SQL Server 2012, we updated the Office renderers. So the old Excel and Word renderers rendered to the 2003 format. The new ones rendered to the 2007, 2010 format. And for backwards compatibility, so that they don't just switch on you in your application without you knowing, they have new names. So the new ones are called Excel OpenXML and Word OpenXML. So instead of doing equals Excel or checking against both of those, one thing you can do is just do, this is just a string, so you can do starts with Excel instead of equals Excel. And then you'll capture both renderers, right? It will work for both. That is everything I wanted to show today. I'm glad that I got through everything. So I have no more tricks, except for that. This was our agenda, and the objective was, again, to be able to design reports that the user doesn't have to go looking for the insights. You present the insights to them, they jump out at them. The insights really pop. Related content, we're already at Thursday, so there's not a lot of remaining sessions related to reporting services. I am doing a session tomorrow on building stylish Power View reports. It's somewhat similar to the session in that we'll give you a deep dive of all sorts of Power View features. This is the session you want to go to if you just want to see the rundown of Power View features and some tips and tricks for building Power View reports, whereas this focused on traditional reporting service reports. There's also a couple of demo stations at the Tech Expo. Some of my colleagues are there. I'll drop by from time to time. If you want to go there and play with the product, learn out about the product, whether it's Power View or traditional reporting services, definitely check that out. There's also a survey that we're going to be doing. We're trying to collect some feedback from our customers who are using reporting services to help us improve the product in future releases. If you can help us fill that out, it's a really quick survey. We'd really appreciate that. Also, Ask the Experts is tonight, and there is a section for BI and reporting services. So if you're free at 6 p.m., come and check that out. If you go to the TechEd website, there's a bunch of additional resources just in general. You can get an eval copy of SQL Server 2012 to try this stuff out. You can look at certifications. Also, there's resources like TechNet and MSDN. There are good links to that. Microsoft Learning if you want to take a course on reporting services or get a certification. That's great. I also just want to call attention to the fact that Italy is going to win tonight. Yes, that's right. Tonight I'll either look like a genius or an idiot. But actually, the great thing about being an Italian soccer fan is that I can't be wrong. If they win, then I was right. If they're wrong, then the match was fixed. Finally, I encourage you to fill out the evaluations. Help us make these sessions even better. You can scan that tag with your phone, or you can just go on the TechEd website and fill out the evaluation. Okay? I think I've got like 4 minutes, so I can probably take a few questions, and I'll stay after, and you can ask more questions. Any questions?
With Report Builder, which you were using there,
Yep.
you wouldn't make it. So one of the reasons we don't use it is because it doesn't integrate with TFS.
Yes, that's right. So the question was whether we are looking at integrating Report Builder into TFS. The answer is no, because Report Builder is an alternative, a simpler alternative to Report Designer in Visual Studio. So it's really targeted at people who don't want the complexity of the Visual Studio shell and source control and all that sort of stuff. And it's targeted at perhaps the power user, but not quite the BI developer. So if you're the BI developer, everything I showed today is still applicable in Report Designer in Visual Studio. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well, I'll stick around after. If you have any questions, come and find me. Thank you very much for coming.